the Fortune Global 500 actually got smaller this year. At Fortune, we follow these big companies for a reason. It's really hard to get on this list, and it's also really hard to stay on this list.
For those who know not much about Fortune 500, could you explain briefly what is it and how the company can be listed?
Sure, happy to do that, and thanks for having me. The Fortune 500 is a global ranking of the world's largest corporations. And so it is a measure of the company's revenue, their sales. We have a formula for how we tabulate the revenue for different kinds of companies. It's very standard, very transparent. We use the data that is reported by the companies themselves. It has to be reported to a government agency. And we take data that is up until whether it's the calendar year, the fiscal year might be in the calendar year, or it might end in the first quarter of the current calendar year. So we accept data up until March 31st of 2021, in this case, for all these companies. And then we rank it. So it's a measure of size. It's not a measure of whether we think that companies are competitive, or it's not a measure of profitability or assets. It is solely a measure of corporate sales.
How was this year list, and what is the most interesting on this year?
Well, I'll tell you a few things about this year's list that are interesting. One is that the Fortune Global 500 actually got smaller this year. Total revenues of the Fortune 500 contracted by about 5%. It was even worse for profits. The profits of these giant companies contracted by 20%. So that was one significant change. There were quite a bit of shifts in terms of winners and losers every year. We have some companies that move up on the list, some companies that move down, some that fall off. There were some notable examples of that this year. It was a very bad year for oil companies because global demand for energy slowed around the world. It was a terrible year for airlines. Virtually all the major airline corporations, in fact, dropped off of our list. It was a bad year for certain types of retailers, including Starbucks, which fell off the list. And it was a bad year for people in the hospitality industry, hotels, so travel agencies, those kind of things. The other thing that's notable about this year's list is that we saw a significant jump in the number of Chinese companies on the list. And last year was the first year that we had companies from China, including Hong Kong, overtake the number of companies from the United States on the Fortune Global 500 list. The first time in the history of the list that happened. This year, the gap between China and the United States got even wider. And that's not too surprising, given that the Chinese economy was able to bounce back from the economic shock of the COVID outbreak, and was able to kind of come roaring back much faster than the United States, which took a long time to administer vaccines and slowly reopen.
Talk about Chinese company, the rapid rate in Fortune 500 of Chinese enterprises. What is the consideration of this phenomenon?
Well, it's a number of things. I mean, I think the underlying factor is that the Chinese economy is growing more rapidly, of course, than the United States and most of the other developed economies. So in that sense, it's not a surprise. The other thing is that China tends to have a lot of big state-owned corporations. And so there's a lot of concentration among them. These are companies like State Grid, the oil companies. They tend to be very large, and they have huge revenues. And so that's helped to propel these companies to the top of the list.
Let's talk about top 3 for this year. Walmart is number 1 again.
Walmart, although many retailers were negatively affected this year, a lot of people bought a lot from Walmart. Companies that were involved with things for the home did really well this year because a lot of people were spending so much time at home. They decided it was time to refurbish, to renovate, so they had extra time to fix them up, and I think that helped Walmart. But it was a challenging year for them, and I think mobilizing the supply chain very difficult at a time when borders were closed. So it's a strong performance by Walmart in a time of challenge. State Grid. State Grid is a big state-owned utility. They provide electricity and power to people in China. So they sort of rumbled on more or less business as usual, I think, this year, particularly because the Chinese economy was so resilient and bounced back so quickly. And then Amazon was one of the big winners, really, of the pandemic. People stopped buying things in physical stores. There was a huge explosion around the world in digital online commerce. People buying things over the internet, and nobody does that better than Amazon. Amazon, figured out how to raise automation in their workplaces, in their warehouses. Just a phenomenal company, and perfectly positioned for the post-pandemic world.
Do you think the list on this year will stay on the next year? Especially the top 10?
I think you'll see a lot of the same companies, but one thing we do find is that the pace of change is just relentless in the modern global economy. And so the turnover in the Fortune Global 500 seems to get faster and faster every year. It's really hard to get on this list, and it's also really hard to stay on this list. And technology and digitization and globalization, I think, make it harder than ever to stay on this list. It used to be that, when I think about economics that I learned maybe in college, that there were these things called barriers to entry, that a company got really big and it had a famous brand and it could monopolize the supply chain and it could monopolize the distribution networks. And more or less it used those advantages and its access to cheap capital to remain deeply entrenched, and that there was not a great deal of turnover amongst the largest companies in the world. I think a lot of those barriers to entry are melting away in an economy that's digitized and globalized. It's becoming possible for very small, nimble companies to rise up very quickly on the list. And I think, for example, of Chinese electronics and smartphone phone manufacturer Xiaomi, for example, which only a couple of years vaulted onto our list. 9-year-old company was able to crack into the Fortune Global 500. That's phenomenal. Xiaomi was one of our biggest gainers this year as well. It's a very young company. It is rising very quickly. So I think we'll continue to see companies like that. I think many of the companies that fell out because of the pandemic and the contraction, Western economies, are going to see big recovery if we can succeed in getting the COVID crisis under control here. That kind of remains to be seen. But I think you're going to see the hotel companies come back, you see the energy companies come back, you see the airlines come back, and a lot of the retailers that were hit hard are going to be able to make a good return as well.
What is the most interesting Asian company on the list this year?
Well, I would point out one Japanese company that's in our top 10, Toyota Motors. They came in at number 9. Toyota had a really interesting year. This has been a kind of a mixed year for automakers, but in some ways it's been a tonic to sales because people are not taking mass transportation. More people are driving to get where they need to go. And that's been particularly the case in the United States. But automobile manufacturers this year had a challenge that was not necessarily related to COVID. They had a challenge in that there was a semiconductor shortage. And increasingly, modern automobiles, in almost all their components, use some form of electronic chips. And shortages, the chip shortage happened for a variety of different reasons, including there were fires in some of the major chip manufacturing plants. So nearly all of the major auto manufacturers had to scale back quite significantly their production because of this chip shortage. The one exception to that was Toyota. And it's a fascinating story as to why that happened. Toyota is famous for really pioneering this just-in-time manufacturing model, where you don't have any inventory, you don't have any stock, and you only take what you need to put on the assembly line right at the very second when it's needed. And so everybody has tried to copy Toyota's model because it's so lean, it's so efficient, and it helps to get their cost margins down. But what's interesting, and we wrote about it, there's a long article by my colleague, Eamon Barrett, in this month's issue of the magazine. Toyota has actually been moving in a different direction for about a decade. And what we discovered is that Toyota, in the aftermath of the 2011 disasters in Fukushima, where they were hit by an earthquake and a tsunami, and then they had a kind of terrible nuclear crisis, Toyota realized that suddenly it was having trouble getting parts and components because of that disaster. And it prompted them to really sit down and think carefully about their entire supply chain. And they realized that they were too lean and that they didn't have enough stock on hand to be prepared for crises. And I think that's a lesson that everyone is learning as we emerge from this pandemic, that supply chains are fragile, and that this notion that all you want to do is just be hyper efficient and you want to be completely dependent on the cheapest source of whatever component it is you're buying is perhaps mistaken, that you need to hedge your risks a little bit. And so what we say in the story about Toyota is that Toyota shifted from focusing only on just in time to also focusing on just in case, and spreading out its supply chain a little bit more and having some inventory. And so the story of how Toyota became a winner by learning to live with inventory and stockpiles, I think is a very important, significant trend. That's a lesson that many other big global manufacturers are learning from the crisis. And I think we'll see some real shifts in supply chain management as a result of that.
What is the benefit of the Fortune 500 for business and enterprise and for the customer?
Well, I don't know if it benefits the customer. It's a mark of prestige for companies. It means you've really arrived. If you've made the list this year to be a member of this very exclusive club of companies, you had to have a minimum revenue of $24 billion. So that's really a remarkable thing, to be one of the 500 largest companies in the world. It says that you've been able to figure out a business model that you've been able to scale to an enormous size. And most of these companies are truly global companies, not all of them, but most of them are. And that means they have operations, manpower all over the world. They're involved in very complex business dealings, that these are pretty sophisticated organizations. And so it's a kind of a snapshot, size of influence and resources in corporations. And at Fortune, we follow these big companies for a reason. That is that we believe very firmly that, for better or worse, the modern corporation is one of the most amazing human inventions ever. It's the best way, and these companies, we're the first to admit that many of them have flaws, but it's the best way civilization has figured out to organize resources, manpower, machines, technology, and get them all working together in a way where everyone is properly incentivized to operate at scale. And so we think that these companies are really important actors on the global scene, for better or worse, and that they're worth paying careful attention to. And so we track their growth, or it might be their contraction. We watch those movements very, very closely every single year.
Wow, this is a very interesting about behind the scene of the Fortune 500. Thank you for being here and thank you for today ค่ะขอบคุณค่ะ